Welcome to Talking Economics, a podcast by CERGE-EI, the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education, Economics Institute, founded in 1991 in Prague. We invite our faculty, researchers, and alumni from around the world to discuss current economic research and its relevance to the challenges and opportunities in a changing world. I'm your host, Katarina Stehlíková. Thank you for joining us. Today's episode asks a simple but urgent question: how are wars, energy shocks, rearmament, and political unpredictability reshaping the real economy? With CERGE-EI alumnus Kamil Kovar, director at Moody's Analytics, we're meeting on April the 9th to discuss how recent geopolitical and economic shocks have unfolded, what the most likely path forward looks like, which alternative scenarios matter the most, and what all of this means for the global economy, Europe, and the Czech Republic. Welcome, Kamil.
Glad to be here.
We are living in a world with overlapping shocks: war, energy disruptions, trade fragmentation, political unpredictability, security rearmament. From a macroeconomic perspective, what has changed most fundamentally?
I always wonder how the people who were doing macroeconomic forecasting in the 90s, what were they doing? They just must have been bored out of their mind, because I have been doing macroeconomic forecasting for 12 years. The first few were, reasonably calm, but ever since the start of the pandemic, it's just, as you said, and one shock after another, and it just doesn't stop. It's interesting, but really hard at the same time. You really have to become experts on a new field. It feels every year, it's the natural gas market, it's the oil market today, it's geopolitics, it's tariffs, it's like every single year there's a new type of shock, new type of field you kind of need to absorb. So on the personal note, a lot has changed. From the perspective of macroeconomic forecasting, right? It's I think one main takeaway from my perspective is it's more and more important to talk in terms of scenarios and not talk in terms of the baseline outlook. Yes, one has to have a baseline outlook, but that's becoming more and more meaningless in nowadays world. Okay. And you really need to say, all right, this is the most likely outcome, sure, but the alternatives are so likely that you need to spell them out and think them through rather than just ignore them and say, hey, this is the most likely and that's the one we'll focus on.
And I guess the number of alternative scenarios has also increased quite dramatically.
Yeah, of course. It's you have to consider more and more of them, right? Because it's also I'm academic economist also in some way, right? So I'm thinking in distributions, right? And the distribution has widened so much that to describe it with 1-2 scenarios, that's really impossible by now. So you really need to have several points in the distribution you pick so that you well describe or approximate the very broad distribution.
So you don't have a favorite shock or the one which has influenced the world the most or your work the most?
I don't know. It's like, honestly, I feel like all of them are my favorite because they teach me something, right? It just like it's hard to know how macroeconomy or economy behaves when you don't really poke it much, right? It just is in this kind of a steady state, so you don't learn much. But all of these shocks, they push us in such a crazy directions which are unimaginable that it really teaches you a lot about, how economies behave and also about how our theories are insufficient and how we need to improve them, right? It's my favorite in this way is the inflationary shock of 2022-2023, which if somebody would have predicted it, or even if somebody would say this is a possibility in let's say beginning of 2021, nobody would take you seriously. That was like inflation in Eurozone 10%. Oh, come on, that's just wrong. And yet it happened, right? So it really taught you, all right, this is the way which we were wrong about our models and about our theories and what we didn't describe in terms of how the economy behaves.
So you learned this, and how did you adjust the models?
I think I adjust my mental model. Adjusting the econometric models is a different story. And I kind of feel like, luckily, that's not my job to do. There are people who dedicate their life, developing academic macroeconomic models. I really don't envy them in some ways, because it just feels like maybe even having one model is wrong. There are different models which are applicable in different times. And in that way, for me, what matters, I'm updating my mental model, or maybe I'm adding different types of models to my mental library of models, so that in future situation, I'm like, all right, is it going to be like this one, or is it going to be like that one? How will we behave, right? Because in some sense, that's a crucial question right now, right? Some people are worrying, okay, we have another large energy shock. Is it going to be like 2022? How far will the inflation go? How fast the input price increase in terms of energy is going to be passed to consumer prices, right? And then it's like, well, some people might go back to the 2022, but I think there are so many important differences that I go to, I borrow a chapter from the 2022 book, but I don't take the whole book. I just borrow a chapter and mix it with other chapters from somewhere else, and that's why I combine it.
So given the current situation and all the shocks that we've experienced, and despite the fact that you said the baseline scenario doesn't make a lot of sense, are you able to say which is your baseline scenario?
So baseline, you still need to have a baseline. It doesn't make sense not to have a baseline. That's your departing point. So we still do, I work for Moody, so we do have a baseline. Our baseline, has been something in March. In beginning, it was, this will be short affair. It's going to be over quick. And the logic really was, the Trump administration has repeatedly showed that it doesn't have a high tolerance for economic costs, right? So it is willing to break with the norms, but it doesn't want to break the global economy, right? So it pushes as far as it can, but not past some point. And it felt like there should be very soon that point where they will back down. Either they had more tolerance this time around, or they actually got into a situation which they didn't know how to get out of. I think it's more of the latter. There's this nowadays famous phrase, it takes two to taco. I guess maybe I will explain a bit. The taco is nowadays the acronym for Trump always chickens out, which means Trump always, when things get tough, changes his mind, changes the tariffs, doesn't invade Iran and all that. And the phrase nowadays, like in this case, it took two parties to abandon the problem or to end the conflict, right? It wasn't just Trump who could unilaterally pull back, like with tariffs or Greenland, but it was also the Iranians. And I think in some sense he was struggling to do that. So that was our March baseline. Our April baseline was darker. We expected, this is going to take a while. It's not going to be immediately. Of course, our April baseline was closed on Tuesday afternoon, and Tuesday evening we got the news of the ceasefire. But personally, I wasn't too surprised. I still maintain that the most likely scenario is that there will be some way for both parties to disengage. Trump clearly wanted to, wasn't sure how he can do it. Iranians, well, for them it's different, but for them what matters the most is establishing deterrence against future attacks. And the deterrence is for them established through the control of Strait of Hormuz. So if they can show for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks that they are in control, then for the future American president, after Trump, it's going to be like, yes, if we attack Iran, they will close the Strait of Hormuz again. Oil will go up again, and that's going to be politically painful, right? So I felt like both sides on some, horizon of weeks will want to disengage. They just need to find a way to do it. Trump will declare victory. We know he will. But it's important that Iranians will play along. And it feels like they will play along around this way of, for next few weeks, they will make it clear we are in charge here. We can always be in charge. And then we will gradually return to normal. So our baseline is still, or my personal baseline is still, come July, oil prices are not that much higher than they were before the war. They will still be higher, 10-20%, but, much less than they are now. And that means that this whole affair will slowly but surely move into the rearview mirror. And that will also allow the economic impacts on growth or inflation to be moderate. On growth especially, probably if it's several months of higher prices, it's not going to affect behavior of firms in terms of investment and consumers in terms of spending. And on inflation, it's going to be a bit longer lasting, but we will reach 3%. And then, by the winter of next, in a year from now, we will be back to 2% and below. So that's still the base case for me, at least.
Geopolitics is really the driver now of the scenarios. You set the baseline scenario. What are the alternatives? What are the main alternatives that you see? And also, how do you actually develop scenarios that are useful instead of speculative, right? Like there is a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty is really the word which defines the world today.
I guess the way we approach it, of course, is it's geopolitics, so you need to think about actors and their motivations, right? And some of the stuff I was saying before, it was clear, like, what are the motivations? For the US, I think it is clear from the reporting that this was ex post a mistake. They thought this is going to go differently. They didn't believe that Iran will be able to close Strait of Hormuz and keep control of it. They didn't think that Iran will be able to continue firing, missiles at the GCC countries or countries in the Middle East. So for them they got into a bad place and they want to get out in some way, right? So that's clear motivation there. We also know the strengths of President Trump, which is always to declare victory and look like you came on top so that you don't look like you lost, right? So there is a clear way out. Then you have to consider what's Iranian incentives, right? And there is like this, on one hand, yes, they would want to control the strait, but they probably understand that the rest of the world will not accept that, right? Imagine that the strait is really closed for the most part. Well, in that situation, the Trump administration is getting the costs and not the benefits, so they go back and pounce more on Iran, right? Iran knows this, wants to avoid this, so they want to also disengage, but they want to do it in a way that they can still establish deterrence for future, right? So these are the actors, motivation, and actions, right? And then you kind of play around with that and think, okay, what are the possibilities? Well, one possibility, the darker scenario, so we have the ceasefire now, or maybe ceasefire is not a good word, but let's call it a ceasefire because that's how it's being called. So one scenario is it breaks down. Why would it break down if both sides don't want it to break down? Well, in a fog of war, things don't really necessarily work out, as in everybody's clear what the other person is doing and stuff like that, right? So it's possible that Iranians, attack some ship or, do something which angers Trump. Trump gets angry and attacks Iran and it escalates again, right? Even though both parties don't want that, they might end up in this place because they might not be fully in control of the situation. So I think going forward, the dark scenario is we get re-escalation, and at that point, Trump really does invade Iran in some localities, right? Either the Kark Island or, around the strait, or he really does bomb, electricity, power plants, bridges, all of this infrastructure, right? And then Iran does close the Strait of Hormuz again. It keeps it closed for longer period of time. So the darker scenario is that we have this is just a pause and we go back for some reason. And in that situation, it probably feels like it's going to last for quite a while. Oil prices will go significantly higher. They will go to, $140 per barrel, 150, 60, who knows. And then the global economy is going to feel much more pain. You might get to a point where companies actually do pull back on their hiring and investment because they start to be really worried about demand. They start to be really worried, where is this all going? Consumers definitely pull back because they are feeling the pain from higher oil prices and fuel prices. The pass-through from the input cost to consumer cost will be much faster. There's a clear non-linearity between the size of the shock and how fast and how much is it passed through. So all of this would lead us possibly to a mild global recession, would be probably most likely outcome. So that's kind of the darker scenario here. The lighter scenario here is that both parties actually have stronger incentives to agree. And we return to normal flow of oil not in 4-6 weeks from now, but we return to normal flow of oil in a week or two. It is conceivable, and in that situation, oil prices could come crashing down faster, right? So there is a better one. We are skeptical of the better one because it doesn't feel like that the incentives of actors are aligned, but it is possible we are misreading them. We are more in favor of the darker one in terms of which alternative is more likely, right? And we were discussing it in my work this morning, and the probabilities we were putting was like escalation again would be 20-25%. Very clean resolution in the near term would be let's say 10%, and the rest is something in between, and it can have very different shades of gray.
Speaking about the dark scenario, you talked about possibly a mild recession. Do you see geographical differences? So who would be impacted the most, and what is the situation for Asia, for China, who is a big player here as well?
Definitely, there are big geographical differences. There are several dimensions around which the geographical dimensions kind of divide. One is, the general size of import of energy a country does, right? So we know Europe is a big importer of energy. It doesn't really produce much relative to how much it consumes. Asian countries, many of them are actually even more so. Most extreme country is Japan. Given its, geographical or geological nature, it really doesn't have almost any oil or gas, which it gets internally. So this is one dimension. The other dimension is also how much oil were countries getting from Middle East, because it doesn't matter on the margin per se, because everybody has the same oil price in the world, right? The fact that Europe doesn't get much oil from the Middle East because it gets mostly from other countries, US, and so on, doesn't really protect you, because there is just one price in the world market. So the fuel price in Czech Republic reflects this, even if we don't import a single drop of oil from Middle East. But on the other hand, it's the Asian countries which do import large quantities from Middle East, they need to find replacement for much bigger chunk of their oil. For us, we need to find replacement for a small part. They need to find for a much bigger part, and that might be complicated. Some governments might be unwilling to pay the price to outbid the other countries, especially poorer Asian countries. Philippines comes to mind. They will be struggling to do that. So that's the other dimension. And along this way, it is really some Asian countries are by far the most exposed. The emerging ones probably the most, because they will be unable to bid for the oil at that price. Pakistan, Philippines are two prime examples. Japan, Korea are also pretty heavily exposed. And then probably India is somewhere along the way. Country in Asia which is least exposed is China, and that's because they have a lot of alternative supplies, Russia being the primary one, and also they have extremely large strategic reserves. So they can actually ride this storm much better than anybody else. That would be in Asia. Europe would be the next. Some countries will benefit. Brazil, exporter of oil, large one. Some other Latin American countries, some countries in Africa, they will benefit. For them, it's good. So it's not bad for everybody. Even though global recession would be bad for everybody, they would probably be better off still because of this.
My question was also, to what extent would be China, for example, motivated to push on Trump or a resolution of the conflict, right? So to what extent can this impact actually create a pushback?
China, I think right now is torn between two things. On one hand, it doesn't want the disruption, right? They are still in the phase where they are gaining relatively strength. So they still want the world order and the economy to proceed in an orderly fashion forward. So they don't want this to go too far. But on the other hand, the Economists had a beautiful headline, right? You never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake. So on the other hand, in a short run, they probably don't mind this going for onwards, right? So that's why I think in some way we might be in the resolution scenario sometime in April and May, because that might be the sweet point for China, like enough pain for US and President Trump, but not too much pain for the global economy.
We talked about the current shock, right? So the current shock and the war in Iran. Let's assume that this will be resolved. Your baseline scenario suggests we have 2-3 months and hopefully it's going to be over. But we have Trump in the US, right? So this probably means there will be something else coming. So what is your scenario in, like how does the world look like?
Yeah, there's going to be something. We have been thinking about it. It's like we have our usual suite of scenarios, and they nowadays are built around bad things happening in geopolitics, the most darkest, let's say, Greenland being invaded, right? And we were like wondering, does the Iran situation make it less likely that these bad things happen? And in some ways it makes it more likely, because he will need a new story in the news, right, for us to forget about Iran, right? So I was like thinking, actually this would be perfect time to reopen the whole Greenland situation, and he did mention Greenland quite a few times in the last few weeks. So that's kind of, I agree, something is likely to happen. But then you get into this point of forecasting. A baseline forecast for us is the most likely outcome. And the most likely outcome is something will happen. Trump will do something bad again. But every single thing he can do on its own is not very likely. It is not very likely he will invade Greenland. It is not very likely he will do something else there. So you're like, all right, something should happen, but I cannot pick one thing to put in my baseline. So you end up in this, uncomfortable position that your baseline is nothing bad happens, because there isn't one specific thing which would be very likely so that it would be plausible in the baseline. So that's kind of our it's kind of philosophy leads you to an outcome which is not great. And that's why I need to talk about the alternative scenarios and about the fact that the distribution of economic outcomes is left skewed. The bad outcomes are more likely than the good outcomes, right? And definitely the median is below is like shifted left relative to the modus, right? I'm sorry, I'm talking a bit of a statistical language, but that's where you end up, because the alternative doesn't work either.
So if you could tell more about the baseline scenario of this type for the medium-term future, and focus specifically on Europe and the Czech Republic.
So the baseline there, I guess, in geopolitical terms, it's characterized by the relationship between US and Europe decaying, for sure. It has already decayed a lot. And that actually lasting even past the Trump administration. Even if the US people decide to elect a Democrat or a moderate Republican, maybe there are such politicians still out there, who knows, we will not go back to the old war, right? So the relationship will fray and decay, and that's going to happen, but the base case, it doesn't fall apart. So we are not considering things like NATO being ended as a likely outcome. NATO is an institution. Even if US would pull out, you would probably still have NATO. But the point is, it's even unlikely that the US would pull out, because yes, the President Trump would like to do that, but there is nowhere enough support in Congress to do that. So it's kind of like getting gradually worse, maybe in periods of time better, depending on the political representation, but definitely not the idyllic 90s or 2000s when we were like all on the same ship and agreed on most things. Not everything, right? The Europeans didn't like the Iraq war, but that by now feels like very quaint worry, right? So that's kind of that, and that kind of leads to what does this mean for Europe, because the European political representation knows this and sees this, so they will try to act about it, together with the fact that there is the threat from Russia, right? Everybody in Europe understand that that's a real threat. So we expect things to kind of improve on the institutional level in Europe, like things like the savings and investment union, or maybe Eurobonds at some point. All of these things on institutional level we will improve, but we will improve only very marginally because the political constraints, the European populations are voting for right-wing parties which are pretty much against EU and EU integration in the face of sovereignty. Czech Republic is a nice example, right? The majority of people are of this, EU is good, but less EU is better, for reasons which are unfathomable to me, but that's the position, right? So that limits how far you can go. And that means, yes, Europe will be providing a countervailing force against this decaying relationship in US, but it's not going to be enough. We will do more spending on defense domestically for sure. We will have bigger defense industry, but it's not gonna make us magically richer in some way, right? We see it already. Look at the agreement about the next generation Eurofighter, right? Where France and Germany just cannot agree. And you're like, if we cannot agree even at this point where there is war in Ukraine, the US is abandoning us and threatening us, then when will we agree on these kind of things? So it's kind of, Europe will be becoming more fragile, and we also think it's going to be falling behind the US and China in terms of how rich and productive it is, because we just cannot compete with these two behemoths, given how we are set up in Europe as a region.
There are so many questions we can continue with. I would focus on the defense spending, because this is something that there is agreement on, and it's a major structural change, right? In the way we operate. Until recently, we were not even able to spend 2% of GDP, and now we're talking about 5%. Yet, all the countries are in huge debts, right? The deficits are also at levels that were unthinkable. So how do we manage this, right? How do we manage these trade-offs? Where do we find the money?
I think for now we ignore the trade-offs. That's politics, right? It's you will spend more. Some countries more than others, right? Germany is very clearly had a awakening moment and is gonna be spending much more in defense. It's gonna build up its defense infrastructure to much larger degree. Some countries will not, right? Spain and Portugal, they are far enough from any threat that they feel like they don't have to, and they have the memory of debt crisis from last year, so they kind of don't want to open the purse strings. Some countries will want to, but will struggle to, and that's of course France, where you have 5% budget deficit, right? So yes, the French president would like to spend more on defense, but is continuously struggling to increase the defense on budget because of these budget constraints. But for the most part, you will kind of try to increase the spending and ignore the fiscal implications for as long as it goes, because ultimately that's what the population wants, right? And that's gonna work out to some degree fine, right? We do know that some increased government spending can actually to a large degree pay for itself, because it's gonna lead to higher productivity. I think especially in Europe right now and in Germany there is a good case to say that the multipliers will be very high, because you have this decaying industrial base, so providing a demand to offset new demand to offset weakening demand from China and abroad is going to actually be really valuable here. So for most part, it's going to be fine. But, then you have to go far out, 20 years from now. And at that point, the trade-offs will come back. And honestly, I don't know how will they resolve, because I'm an economist, I think in terms of equilibrium, and I don't think there is an equilibrium there. It's really hard to understand how that will resolve, but good for us, that's far into the future, so we can kind of forget about it for now.
a very last question. So the government is increasing its spending. How does it impact the private businesses, and does it crowd out? Is the multiplier the main effect?
Several ways we think about it. One is, more spending good for some businesses, right? On the other hand, you would think in some very standard macro, you would think, okay, that means we have to crowd out somebody. But I think when we were looking in the empirical literature, it feels like the crowding out is relatively weak. And as I was saying in my previous answer, it's specifically now, you are adding demand to sectors which are actually losing demand. So in some sense, there's these nice stories where, factories for cars, which were becoming underutilized, are transformed into factories for tanks. Now we don't get cars, we get tanks. So that's on welfare basis, it's not really great, but on the GDP basis, it actually is pretty great. Plus, there is a very clear potential for increase in productivity in the actual defense sector, because that defense sector was small, it was basically surviving, and there will definitely be a large economies of scale to gain. There's a nice story about building some of these missiles, how since they were agreed between multiple countries, the process is incredibly complicated, because they do this part in France, then they ship it to Italy, then they do that part there, then ship it to, Spain or whatever, right? And if we overcome some of the political obstacles, there is a huge productivity gains to be made. So in that way, it's gonna be good for the broader economy. And it's coming in really fortunate time, because as I said, we are losing one demand, so replacing it in the similar industry with standard demand is very fortunate. So in that way, it will be very beneficial for the economy, at least in the, when I talk about the next 2, 4, 6 years. Past that, it's harder to say, of course, but for now, it's gonna be very strong multipliers.
Well, we can say that past that there are so many other underlying trends and changes that maybe they will push out. Maybe AI will save us.
Maybe AI will save us. We are all praying for that.
So with that, I would really like to thank you for being here and talking to us. Thank you.
It was a pleasure talking to you too.